Hello and welcome to my channel. This is the second part of my how to paint a portrait tutorial, beginning with an underpainting. In this part we will begin with the actual painting in color. If you haven't seen the first part, I recommend you watch it before this one, because there I talk about how to analyze your reference, how to place facial features in a very easy way, and the importance of values and brushwork. Since we have established our values already, we can see exactly where we have to go brighter and darker. Now, sometimes it is not easy to convert values from grayscale into color, but don't panic or become impatient. We will do it step by step. How long it takes doesn't matter, because painting is not about speed. There is this misconception that you have to paint or draw fast. It's simply not true. If it takes you 5 hours or 5 weeks, if you think about it, what does it matter? Except, of course, you have to meet a deadline because you work on commission. But if you're just painting or drawing to enjoy the process, time is not really important. Having said that, let's see what we can do to get the values right. Right now we have to handle 3 problems: the values, the saturation or the chroma, and the hue, or we can also say color. We have to juggle with 3 balls at the same time, and as a beginner that is really challenging. But what is easier than to juggle with 3 balls? Juggling with 2 balls. Let's try that. Since we have our underpainting, the values are already there. We literally just need to grab them. And that is what we do. We open our color wheel and press and hold a point on our canvas where we want to sample the values. It is important that we open the color wheel before we sample the color, because then we can see where exactly we are on the value range. Now all we have to think about is getting the saturation and the hue right. And those two come very close together. You can almost combine them. They come in a package. And suddenly there is only 1 ball left in the game instead of 3. Before we check the colors and the saturation, give me a minute or 2 to explain something. Very often we tend to select color in a very high chroma. The more saturated it seems, the better. I think one reason why our brain works like that is because when we were kids we painted with these mediums. And as you can see, the way we can alter the saturation is very limited. You can lower the saturation somehow, but at a certain point you can't add to it. And often there's only the choice between all or nothing. And since we learned how to handle crayons and markers at a very early stage in our lives, we seem to know about how to use them. Like we know how to walk or how to ride a bicycle, and we feel very confident and comfortable about these things. So we connect painting automatically with high saturated colors. Since we have used markers and crayons when we were young, we don't think it's necessary to learn about it now, and very often we forget about the fact that we know a lot about color, but we don't know much about values. And the result is that we think we don't have talent once we tried and failed, which is not true. Don't forget that it's not your lack of talent, it's about that we have to discover values and chroma again, or even for the very first time. Let's try something. I will sample a color from my painting. I don't care where. Maybe here or here. And also have a look at the color wheel. Do you notice something? All colors I have sampled never had more than 50% saturation. It doesn't matter if I choose bright or dark colors or colors that look especially vivid to me. It doesn't matter where I sample the colors, they always stay on the left half of my color wheel. And I could do this for hours. Here's another example. This is a picture I took on a sunny day right in front of my door. And let's run the same experiment again. Let's start by sampling the color from the sky, because the sky looks very vivid. But you can see the chroma on my color wheel. It's actually not. Let's sample the color of the roof and maybe the wall. Let's try the foliage on the flower pot. You can see there's a pattern on how colors appear in nature. The only part in the entire picture where the chroma came to about 90% of full saturation is one part inside this flower. To be precise, only one single pixel had almost the highest saturation. Okay, enough theory, let's begin with the second part. There are no areas of high contrast in the source photo, so I began blocking in halftones. I paint on a separate layer for now, but later I will merge them together and paint right over the underpainting. But if you are more comfortable to paint everything on a separate layer, that's fine. Don't worry too much about the color. You don't need the exact color. If you want to go more into the reds, feel free to do so. If you want to go more into the yellows, it's entirely up to you. But for those of you who have trouble finding the right values or colors, here is a screenshot of the final painting with some of the most important colors. Simply add a new color palette or copy the hexadecimal codes or paste the screenshot as a separate layer into your canvas and sample the colors directly. But that's just optional. If you want to practice finding your own colors and values, that's fine. What you should focus about, and I can never say it often enough, are the values. Depending on the style you paint in, it will of course change the way how you choose your hues and values and chroma. Even if you go with a flat design, there will be eventually at least a few different values you can find. If you paint in a more realistic way, you can't go without values. In this case, I saw that on her forehead the hue shifts towards yellow or orange since the flesh is not as thick as in some other parts in her face, and the sun reflects a lot in this area. The cheek on her left side is more on the red side, since that's an area with a lot of muscle and flesh. It means more blood vessels are in this part on her face. In this area where the face is slowly turning away from the sunlight, it's not really considered a shadow, but a darker halftone, and it is still on the warm side. The right side of her forehead is turned towards the sun, so the hue should be on the warm side. But now we can observe something very interesting. There are lots of blues and purples to be seen in a brighter value. Since this picture is a montage, we can't clearly say, but these kind of effects are caused by the reflected light usually. Reflected light is a light source other than the primary light source, which is the sun in this case. Reflected light could be skylight, water, a wall, or any other object that projects light onto another surface by causing the light to bounce off its surface. Look at this example. I have a white sheet of paper on my table and place these two books in an angle so that they would throw a cast shadow on the paper. But as you can observe, not only is the value darker where the shadow is being cast, there's also reflected light in it. The upper shadow looks more reddish, while the lower shadow looks more bluish. What we also observe is that areas with brighter values are less saturated than other parts. The lighter skin gets, the less saturated it gets as well. It looks bluish, but there is no blue in it. When we zoom in and sample the color, you can see that it is instead a very low saturated red that tends toward the cool side of the color wheel. But the effect we can achieve is that it almost looks like blue. So you don't need to use blue. Use a cooler version of the same color just in a lower saturation and it will appear in a bluish tone. It is really difficult to explain and comment on every brush stroke I lay down, and it's actually also not the purpose of this tutorial. Instead, copying every brush stroke, you should try to apply what we have learned. So when you are laying down a brush stroke, consider these three things together. Is the value lighter, darker, or the same? Is the hue on the warm or on the cool side compared to its surroundings? And is the saturation higher or lower? But I will give my best to explain the most important steps. For example, when I lay down a brush stroke, I try to go with the natural flow of the skin or the hair. I would never do this, for example, and go across. It would destroy the illusion of the object looking realistic. The space between her eyes is called the glabella, and it is darker in value than the bridge of the nose and the forehead. Another darker value you can find at the corner of her eye. This is also an area where the light does not hit fully. I focus on the hair a bit and make them a bit longer to see how it would look at this point of the painting. But I always follow the direction how the hair falls. I also won't paint every single hair. I will look for the values instead. In order to show texture, you don't need to paint the actual texture. You give the illusion of texture. At this point, I see that my halftones were too bright, so I adjust them where it is necessary. Here you can see how I darken the values of the chin, and we can observe the same optical illusion like before. I did not use purples or blues, but instead a very low saturated red. If you want to emphasize this area, you can go a bit cooler with your red on the color wheel. I am adding a shadow underneath her eye, and again I'm using a very low saturated darker value of red. Don't be afraid to go too dark. I darken the area between her eye and the upper eyelid. There is a thin area underneath the eye that catches light. That is the lower eyelid, and it has a brighter value. Here I flip the canvas in order to see the painting with fresh eyes. The problem with painting is that your eyes get accustomed to the picture very quickly and it will get very hard to spot mistakes. If you flip the canvas, you might be surprised sometimes how many things could look off. Don't be shocked though, everything can be fixed. Don't be afraid to go dark with your values on the lips. I used a darker red on the cool side of the color wheel. Okay, let's have a look at this shadow. When we're new to drawing and painting, our brain tends to ignore shadows. We unconsciously make the decision that all kinds of shadows somehow ruin the beauty of a face, or maybe I should say, are not conform with the idealized version of a beautiful face. All facial features we want to present in the best possible way and light. That is why we are so stingy with shadows. But this shadow you can see here is very important since it emphasizes what we know about her surroundings. It's outdoors, it's sunny, she's squinting her eyes, the sunlight casts shadows. The color for this shadow is a very low saturated red on the cool side. Make sure that your halftones are not too bright, because elsewise you can't see your highlights properly. You want to make them pop, and in order to do so, the contrast must be high enough. Eyebrows are a crucial part in the portrait since they tell us a lot about the mood and the scene. They are very important for the storytelling in the picture as well. Aya draws her eyebrows together to protect her eyes from the sun, So the look on her face appears to be serious or focused. If your eyebrows are drawn upwards, it will give her a surprised facial expression. The more you draw them together, the angrier she looks. If you draw them together and upwards at the same time, it will give her face some sort of embarrassed expression. So be careful with your eyebrows. I'm adding more of the background now, which helps a lot to find values. There's a very interesting phenomena called simultaneous contrast. If you place a dark halftone, let's say on a white background, the halftone will appear darker than it actually is. If you place the same halftone on a black background, it will appear much lighter than it actually is. That's why I prefer to begin on a stained canvas to see the values better. I'm focusing a bit on the hood, but I won't add details. I only want to see how the shape would look like. I darken the values underneath her chin because that is an area where only a little light hits her skin. I used a red which is on the warm side, fairly low saturated and in a darker value. A tip: after a while, when you have laid down a good amount of halftones, you don't need to open your color wheel every time you want to change your color value or chroma. Simply find a similar spot on your painting and sample the color from there. Doing this will also make sure all your colors stay in the same neighborhood and you are not going overboard with hundreds of colors on your palette. Now I'm trying to bring some texture to her hair. For this part I changed my brush. I believe I used the dry brush or the turpentine brush. So basically I am just indicating where the light might reflect on her hair. But I recommend you don't go overboard with the highlights. We don't want to destroy the beautiful darks that surround her face. At this stage I'm almost done with the painting. I flip the canvas quite often now and compare the values with my source photo and make adjustments here and there. At a certain point I stop using my reference and instead I make adjustments that please me personally. And I encourage you to do the same. Instead of copying everything exactly, be creative and modify parts in your painting wherever you want. With a painting you express yourself and it can be seen in color, brushwork, modifications in the subject or background. There are no limits on what you can do and what not. I begin painting the hood. And you can see in our source photo that it is some sort of rough spun woolen material. Now I can't and I also don't want to paint the texture of the hood. There are several reasons why I won't paint the texture. Firstly, I painted her face and hair in a painterly style without much detail. Would I render the clothing very detailed, the painting would not appear coherent anymore. The eye would automatically be drawn to the clothing, which we don't want. We want people to look at her face, so the less detailed, the better. Secondly, the hood is not the main focal point in the painting. The less obvious it is, the better. Later our brain will understand that she's wearing a woolen hood. We can see it from the context, so we don't worry too much about it. Again, instead we work with values. Make sure that your darks are not 100% black. In nature, even the darkest darks still have a brighter value due to various light sources. For the hair, I used dark reds, like a dark scarlet for example, and I also saw lots of purple tones on the right side. For the highlights in her hood I used a very bright, low saturated yellow, not the pure white, because there is a lot of sunlight in those highlights. At this stage I found I want to finish the portrait itself, and I play around with some brushes on a layer I put on top of the portrait layer to see what could be done to make it look more interesting. I'm not very good with that, and I'm sure you can do a much better job than I. This is the end of this tutorial. I hope it was somehow helpful to you. It's just my second how to paint tutorial, so I think there is much room for improvement on my part. If you have questions, please let me know in the comment section. I would be pleased to answer them. And please feel free to give critique for this video in any way, in order to help me how to explain it better and easier in my future videos. I'm still new to this, and I hope with your help I can improve quickly. Tell me if you would like to see every single brush stroke, if I should do it faster, if I should explain more about the choices I made, or anything else. Critique would be highly appreciated. I'm Chris, this is SpeedDrawFactory. Don't forget to check out my other stuff. Thank you very much for watching, and see you in the next video.
And for heaven's sake, don't paint pretty.